The train depot in Copper Creek stood silent as Clara Whitmore read the crumpled letter for the third time, each word cutting deeper than before. Miss Whitmore, upon further consideration, I find you unsuitable for the position of wife. Position. As if marriage were merely employment. As the last passenger disappeared into the Arizona dust, leaving her alone with a single trunk and shattered dreams, a weathered cowboy approached. Ma'am, seems you could use some help? Stay with me, dear listeners, to discover how abandonment became destiny. And please comment below which town you're watching from. I'd love to know how far Clara's story has traveled. The Arizona sun bore down mercilessly on the wooden platform of Copper Creek's depot, creating shimmering waves of heat that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. Clara Whitmore stood motionless, her traveling dress already damp with perspiration, the letter trembling in her gloved hand. Around her, the bustle of arriving passengers had died away, leaving only the creaking of wooden signs and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Unsuitable, she whispered again, tasting the bitter word. Thomas Hartley, the man who had courted her through 6 months of letters, who had painted pictures of a life together, managing his mercantile store, who had sent her the train fare that represented her entire future, that same man had taken one look at her and decided she wouldn't do. The letter had been waiting at the station master's office, delivered by a nervous boy who'd scurried away before she could question him. Thomas hadn't even possessed the courage to reject her in person. I regret to inform you that your manner of speech and evident education would not suit the simple life of a merchant's wife in Copper Creek. I have enclosed funds for return passage to St. Louis. I wish you well in finding a more appropriate situation. Clara crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The funds, he mentioned, amounted to half what she needed for return passage, a final insult that left her stranded between two worlds. You waiting on someone, miss? The voice startled her from her spiral of despair. A tall man stood several feet away, his hat casting shadows across weathered features that spoke of countless days under the desert sun. His clothes were practical worn leather chaps over denim, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and boots that carried the dust of many miles. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, steady and gray, like storm clouds, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but something close to understanding. No, Clara said, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. I'm not waiting for anyone. Not anymore. The man's gaze shifted to her trunk, a fine leather piece that looked absurdly out of place on the rough platform, then to the letter still clutched in her hand, and finally back to her face. Train doesn't come back through for 3 days, he observed. Hotel's that way if you're looking for lodging. Thank you. Clara managed, though she knew the few coins in her purse wouldn't cover even one night at any respectable establishment. She'd spent her last substantial money on a new dress for this meeting, wanting to make the best impression on her future husband. The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. The stranger turned to leave, then paused. Miss, forgive the intrusion, but you wouldn't be the lady from St. Louis, the one Hartley was supposed to— He stopped, clearly reading the answer in her expression. I see. News travels fast in small towns, Clara said bitterly. Faster than wildfire in drought season, he agreed. Tom Hartley's a fool, if you'll pardon my saying so. Before Clara could respond, he touched the brim of his hat and strode away his spurs, creating a rhythmic jingle that faded into the afternoon heat. She watched him go, this stranger who'd offered more genuine kindness in 2 minutes than Thomas Hartley had shown in 6 months of correspondence. The sun had shifted lower by the time Clara finally moved. She couldn't stand on the platform forever, no matter how much she wished to simply disappear into the wavering heat. With effort, she grasped the handle of her trunk and attempted to lift it. The weight nearly pulled her off balance, everything she owned in the world, packed with such hope just days ago. Let me. The same voice, the same steady presence. The cowboy had returned, and without waiting for permission, he lifted her trunk as easily as if it contained feathers instead of her entire life. I don't need— Clara began, pride flaring despite her circumstances. Of course you don't, he interrupted mildly. But the way I see it, we all need a hand sometimes. Question is whether we're smart enough to take it when it's offered. He started walking toward town carrying her trunk with one hand, while his other rested casual-like near the gun belt at his hip. Clara found herself following partly because he had her belongings and partly because she had nowhere else to go. "Jack Mercer," he said over his shoulder. "I run the Double M Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Clara Whitmore," she replied, quickening her pace to keep up with his long strides. "Though I suppose you already knew that." "Figured as much. Hartley's been crowing about his mail-order bride for weeks. Man couldn't keep his mouth shut if his life depended on it." The casual mention of what she'd been a mail-order bride, goods to be delivered and inspected, made her cheeks burn with humiliation. "I prefer to think of it as accepting a position that included marriage," she said stiffly. Jack Mercer actually chuckled at that, a warm sound that took the sting out of her embarrassment. "That's a fine way of putting it, Miss Whitmore. Shows you got spine." They'd reached the edge of town proper, where wooden buildings lined a main street that was more dust than road. The Imperial Hotel sat on the corner, its painted sign proclaiming "Finest Accommodations in Copper Creek," with a confidence that the building's weathered exterior didn't quite support. Jack set her trunk down on the hotel's porch with surprising gentleness. "Martha runs a clean place," he said. "She'll treat you fair." "Mr. Mercer," Clara began, then stopped. How could she explain that even a fair price was beyond her means, that she'd gambled everything on a promise that had evaporated like morning dew in the desert? He studied her for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "There's another option," he said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. "If you're interested." Clara waited, her heart beating rapidly, though she couldn't say why. "I got a ranch needs tending and no one to tend it. House hasn't seen a woman's touch since my mother passed 3 winters back. I can offer room board and wages for housekeeping work." He paused, then added with careful neutrality, nothing more expected or offered beyond that. The proposition hung between them like dust motes in the afternoon sun. Clara knew she should be offended a strange man suggesting she come to his ranch unchaperoned. But there was something in his manner, a straightforwardness that spoke of honest intent rather than impropriety. "Why?" she asked simply. Jack removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that showed threads of premature silver. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have the world pull the rug out from under you. Maybe because I need the help and you need the work. Or maybe," he looked directly at her, "because any woman brave enough to travel halfway across the country on a promise deserves better than Tom Hartley's cowardice." The sound of laughter erupted from the saloon across the street, harsh and mocking. Through the swinging doors, Clara glimpsed men gathered around tables, their faces flushed with drink and mid-afternoon idleness. One of them might even be Thomas Hartley, celebrating his narrow escape from an unsuitable bride. "Your reputation," Clara began, "is my own concern," Jack finished. "As for yours, well-meaning, no disrespect, but standing here debating it in public probably isn't helping matters." He had a point. Already she could see curtains twitching and windows' faces peering out to witness the abandoned bride's next move. By evening, everyone in Copper Creek would know that Thomas Hartley had rejected his mail-order bride and that Jack Mercer had been seen talking with her. The stories would write themselves regardless of what she actually did. "I need to think," Clara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew her options were vanishingly few. "Fair enough." Jack replaced his hat and turned to go, then looked back. "I'll be at Murphy's General Store for the next hour loading supplies. After that I head back to the Double M. Decision's yours, Miss Whitmore, but sunset comes early this time of year, and the desert's no place to be caught wondering what to do next." He walked away without looking back, his figure solid and sure against the chaotic backdrop of Copper Creek's main street. Clara stood on the hotel porch, her trunk at her feet, her future balanced on the edge of a choice she'd never imagined making. Inside the hotel, she could hear voices, the clink of dishes from what must be a dining room. The normal sounds of people living their normal lives while hers had derailed as surely as if the train that brought her had jumped its tracks. She thought of St. Louis, of the typing position she'd given up, of the boarding house room she'd vacated, of the bridges burned in pursuit of a dream sold through letters and promises. Even if she could somehow scrape together the train fare, what waited for her there, The humiliation of return, the whispers of failure, the struggle to find work again with no references and no explanation for her sudden departure that wouldn't mark her as foolish. Clara opened her purse and counted the coins again, though she already knew the sum by heart. Enough for 2 nights at the hotel if she didn't eat, enough for meals if she slept in the street, not enough for both, and certainly not enough for a new beginning. The sun had moved perceptibly lower, painting the buildings with golden light that would soon fade to purple dusk. Through the saloon doors, the laughter grew louder, and she heard someone mention Hartley's name, followed by coarse jokes she pretended not to understand. Clara picked up her trunk, surprised to find she could manage its weight when necessity demanded it. She walked down the main street, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her progress. Murphy's General Store stood at the far end, its wide doors open to the afternoon air. She found Jack Mercer loading sacks of flour onto a weathered wagon, his movements efficient and economical. He looked up as her shadow fell across the doorway, but didn't stop his work. "Mr. Mercer," Clara said, setting down her trunk with relief. "Your offer, is it still open?" He hefted another sack, the muscles in his arms straining against his shirt. "It is." "Then I accept, with conditions." That made him pause, turning to face her fully. "I'm listening." Clara had thought through her words on the walk over, knowing she had one chance to establish the terms of this arrangement. "I'll keep your house and cook your meals. In return, I want fair wages, Sundays off, and the understanding that this arrangement can be terminated by either party with 2 weeks' notice." "Seems reasonable," Jack said. "Anything else?" "Yes." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I want respect. Whatever the town chooses to think or say, I need to know that in your house I'll be treated as an employee, not as something else." Jack's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Whitmore, I've got about as much use for town gossip as a fish has for a bicycle. You do your work. I'll pay your wages, and what anybody else thinks about it can go hang." He extended his hand. "Deal." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, sun-browned, honest. Taking it would mean stepping into the unknown, trusting a stranger, abandoning the last pretense of the life she'd planned. But the alternative was a slow dissolution into poverty and desperation, begging for scraps of charity in a town where she'd already been marked as unwanted goods. She took his hand, surprised by its warmth, and the careful way he gripped hers, firm enough to seal a bargain, gentle enough to acknowledge her as a lady despite their business arrangement. "Deal," she said. Jack released her hand and turned back to his loading. "We'll be heading out in about 20 minutes. You need anything from town before we go?" Clara thought of Thomas Hartley, probably sitting in his mercantile store, relieved at his narrow escape. She thought of the letter still crumpled in her pocket with its insulting offer of insufficient funds and dismissive words. "No," she said firmly. "I have everything I need." The ride to the Double M Ranch took them away from Copper Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Clara sat beside Jack on the wagon bench, her trunk secured in the back with the supplies. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open country that stretched endlessly under the vast Arizona sky. Jack handled the team of horses with the same quiet competence he seemed to bring to everything. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary chatter, which Clara appreciated. After the morning's upheaval, the steady creak of wagon wheels and rhythmic clop of hooves provided an oddly soothing soundtrack to her racing thoughts. "That your first time out west?" Jack asked, eventually, his eyes on the rutted road ahead. "Yes," Clara admitted. "I'd never been farther from St. Louis than Kansas City before this week." "Takes some getting used to," he said. "The space of it all. Some folks can't handle it, feel like they're going to get swallowed up by all that sky." Clara looked around at the landscape, red rocks jutting from sandy soil, scattered cacti standing like sentinels, mountains that seemed to float on the horizon. It was alien, almost lunar compared to the green hills and forests of Missouri. Yet there was something liberating about it too, as if the vastness offered possibilities rather than threats. "It's beautiful," she said, surprising herself with the observation. "Different, but beautiful." Jack glanced at her, a hint of approval in his expression. "Most folks don't see it right away. They're too busy missing what they left behind." What I left behind wasn't worth missing, Clara said before she could stop herself. That why you answered Hartley's advertisement. The question was asked mildly without judgment, but Clara still felt heat rise to her cheeks. Among other reasons, Jack seemed to accept that, returning his attention to driving. After another mile, he pointed to a cluster of buildings emerging from the heat shimmer. That's the Double M. The ranch house sat low and sturdy against the landscape built from adobe and timber that had weathered to the color of the surrounding earth. It wasn't grand, nothing like the two-story homes she'd known in St. Louis, but it looked solid, permanent, as if it had grown from the desert itself rather than been built upon it. A barn stood to the left, its doors open to reveal shadows and the movement of horses within. Corrals branched off from it, containing cattle that raised their heads to watch the wagons approach. To the right of the house, she could see what might be a garden plot, though it was hard to tell in the fading light. "It's not much," Jack said, an unexpected note of uncertainty in his voice. "Like I said, it's been just me for a while." "It looks like a home," Clara said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the ranch's practical simplicity, the way it seemed to exist in harmony with its surroundings rather than fighting against them. Jack pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to offer Clara his hand, a courtesy she hadn't expected. His grip was steady as he helped her navigate the high step in her traveling dress. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "Doors open, go on in and look around." Clara climbed the 2 steps to a covered porch that ran the length of the house's front. A rocking chair sat to one side, its wood smooth from use. She pushed open the door and stepped into dimness that gradually resolved into details as her eyes adjusted. The main room served multiple purposes: kitchen along one wall with a large stove, and workable surfaces dining area marked by a sturdy table and 4 chairs, and a sitting area with a leather couch that had seen better days and a stone fireplace. Everything was clean enough, but had that particular bareness that marked a bachelor's dwelling, functional, but devoid of softness or decoration. "Your room would be through there," Jack said from behind her, setting her trunk down with care. He pointed to a door on the left. "Was my mother's sewing room, but it's got a bed and dresser. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." Before Clara could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet house. She stood for a moment, absorbing the strange reality of her situation. This morning, she'd awakened on a train full of dreams about her new life as Mrs. Thomas Hartley. Now she stood in a stranger's house, hired help instead of a wife, her future as uncertain as the desert wind. But she was also safe, at least for tonight. She had a roof over her head and the promise of wages to earn. It was more than she'd had an hour ago, and Clara had learned to be grateful for small mercies. She explored the room that would be hers, finding it exactly as Jack had described: simple, but adequate. The narrow bed was made up with clean, if worn linens, and the dresser, though scarred with age, was solid. A window looked out toward the mountains, now painted purple and gold by the setting sun. Clara unpacked slowly, hanging her dresses so carefully chosen for her new life in the small wardrobe. Her hands lingered on the blue silk she'd planned to wear to church as Thomas Hartley's wife. With sudden decision, she pushed it to the back. That woman, that future was gone. She needed to focus on who she was now. A knock at the main door interrupted her thoughts. She found Jack standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. "I usually just have bread and cold meat for supper, but there's plenty if you'd like some." Clara realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast on the train, her stomach too knotted with nerves for the stops along the way. "That sounds wonderful." They ate at the kitchen table in companionable silence, the simple meal more satisfying than she'd expected. Jack had added cheese and early tomatoes from what she now confirmed was indeed a garden plot, though one fighting a losing battle with the desert. "I can work on the garden," Clara offered, gesturing toward the window. "If you'd like." "If you can get anything to grow properly in that soil, you're welcome to try," Jack said with a wry smile, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less careworn. "My mother had the touch for it, but I surely don't." "Tell me about the ranch," Clara said, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly to keep the conversation on safe professional ground. "How many cattle?" "How many hands?" "About 200 head at the moment," Jack replied. "As for hands, you're looking at 'em." Clara's surprise must have shown because he continued. "Had to let the others go last year. Drought hit hard and beef prices dropped. I've been managing, but..." He shrugged the gesture, saying more than words about the struggle of running a ranch alone. But you're hiring me, Clara pointed out. That seems way backwards, Jack supplied. Maybe, but a man can only do so much. The house, the cooking, the garden, those things slide when you're out with the cattle from dawn to dusk. And sliding turns into falling apart quick enough. Figure if I can keep the inside together, maybe I can focus on keeping the outside from going under. There was logic to it, Clara supposed, though she suspected there was more to his offer than pure practicality, but she wasn't in a position to question good fortune, however it came disguised. I'll do my best, she said simply. I believe you will, Jack replied, standing and collecting the plates before she could. You should rest. Tomorrow will come early, it always does out here. He washed the dishes despite her protests, then bid her goodnight, heading to his own room at the back of the house. Clara sat alone at the table, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The distant low of cattle, the whisper of wind against adobe walls, the creak of cooling timbers. She pulled Thomas Hartley's letter from her pocket, smoothing it one last time. The words still stung, but their power was fading. By lamplight, she could see how hastily it had been written, how cowardly its message. A man who could dismiss a woman so easily after drawing her across half a continent was no loss, she told herself. Clara held the letter over the lamp's flame, watching it catch and curl. She dropped it into an empty bowl, letting it burn to ash, a small funeral for dreams that had died before they could live. Tomorrow she would begin earning her keep in this strange new place. She would cook and clean and try to coax life from the stubborn garden. She would prove herself useful, valuable, even to the quiet man who'd offered her sanctuary when the world had left her stranded. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as Clara prepared for bed in the small room that was now hers, she thought perhaps unplanned lives might have their own possibilities. The desert, after all, bloomed in unexpected ways, rare and startling, and all the more precious for being unforeseen. Sleep came slowly, her mind churning with the day's upheaval. But when it finally arrived, it was deep and dreamless, as if the desert silence had wrapped around her like a blanket holding her safe until morning. She woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen, quiet, deliberate sounds of someone trying not to disturb. The window showed the faintest hint of dawn, the mountains' black silhouettes against a lightning sky. Clara dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, pulling her hair back in a practical bun. When she emerged from her room, she found Jack at the stove brewing coffee with the concentrated attention of someone performing a sacred ritual. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee'll be ready in a minute." "I should be doing that," Clara said. "It's what you hired me for." "You weren't up yet," Jack replied pragmatically. "And I've been making my own coffee for years. One more morning won't hurt." But Clara could see this was exactly the kind of thing he needed help with, the small daily tasks that accumulated, stealing time from the larger work of keeping the ranch alive. She watched how he made the coffee, noting his preferences for future mornings. "What would you like for breakfast?" she asked, already mentally cataloging the supplies she'd seen. "Whatever's easy. I usually just have biscuits if there are any left, or bread and jam." Clara found the ingredients for flapjacks and set to work, grateful for a familiar task in an unfamiliar place. Jack watched her work with surprised appreciation, then excused himself to tend to the horses. By the time he returned, she had a proper breakfast waiting: flapjacks, golden and steaming bacon, crisp eggs fried just right. Jack stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking at the spread with something approaching wonder. "I haven't had a breakfast like this since—" He trailed off, then seemed to shake himself. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. This is more than I expected." "It's my job," Clara said, but she was pleased by his reaction. "And please, if we're to be working together, you might call me Clara." "Claris," he repeated, as if testing the sound. "Then you'd better call me Jack. All this Mr. Mercer makes me look for my father." It was a small thing, the exchange of first names, but it marked a shift from strangers thrown together by circumstance to something approaching partnership, however temporary. After breakfast, Jack showed her around the property properly. The barn housed 4 horses, his riding mount a steady mare named Belle, 2 work horses for the wagon, and a young colt that followed them with curious eyes. "He's not broke yet," Jack explained. "Haven't had the time, maybe in the fall." The cattle were range stock hardy longhorns mixed with some newer breeds scattered across the property's acres. Jack pointed out the boundaries marked by natural features rather than fences, a dry creek bed to the east, a ridge of red rocks to the west. Water's the real challenge, he explained, showing her the well and the complex system of troughs and channels he'd built to distribute it. We get rain maybe 3 times a year if we're lucky. Rest of the time, it's this well and prayer. The garden was indeed a sad sight, rows of withered plants struggling against the heat and dry soil. Clara knelt and crumbled a handful of earth between her fingers, already thinking about compost and irrigation and the seeds she'd seen in the general store. "It needs work," she said diplomatically. Jack actually laughed at that. "That's like saying the desert needs water. True, but understated." They continued the tour, Jack pointing out the smokehouse, the root cellar, a small workshop where he did repairs. Everything was functional, but showed the strain of one man trying to do too much. "I'll leave you to get settled," Jack said finally. "I need to ride out and check the north pasture. Had some fence down last week, and I want to make sure the cattle haven't wandered. I'll be back by supper." Clara watched him saddle Belle with practiced ease, noting the way he checked every strap and buckle with careful attention. He swung into the saddle as naturally as walking, touching his hat brim in farewell before heading out across the desert. Alone, Clara stood in the middle of the ranch yard, taking stock of her new domain. The sun was fully up now, already promising another day of scorching heat. But there was work to do, and work had always been Clara's refuge when life became too complicated to think about. She started with the house, doing a thorough inventory of supplies and necessities. The pantry was adequately stocked with basics, but lacking in variety. She found preserved meats, beans, flour, cornmeal, and various canned goods, the diet of a man who ate to live rather than live to eat. The house itself needed attention. Windows clouded with dust floors that hadn't seen a proper mopping in months, curtains that were more suggestion than fabric. But the bones were good, the structure sound. It could be made comfortable, even welcoming, with effort. Clara rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By the time Jack returned that evening, the kitchen gleamed. She'd scrubbed every surface, reorganized the shelves for efficiency, and even managed to polish the old stove until it reflected light. The windows were clear, letting in views of the desert painted gold by the setting sun. She had supper waiting, a stew made from the preserved beef flavored with herbs she'd found growing wild near the well. Fresh bread cooled on the counter, and she'd even managed a simple cake from the supplies on hand. Jack stood in the doorway, dusty and tired from his day's work, staring at the transformation. "You've been busy," he said finally, something soft in his voice. "It's good to have work to do," Clara replied, setting plates on the table. "How was the fence?" "Mended for now, though I swear sometimes the cattle break it just to give me something to fix." He washed at the basin she'd set out, then joined her at the table. "This smells incredible." They ate quietly, but it was a comfortable quiet. Jack told her about the ranch's daily routines, the challenges of the coming roundup, the personalities of various cattle that had become familiar to him. Clara found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about ranching life that seemed to please him. "You know," Jack said as she served the cake, "I was half afraid I'd made a mistake this morning. Offering you this job, I mean. Thought maybe I'd let sympathy override sense." Clara felt a flutter of anxiety. "And now I'm thinking maybe we both caught a piece of luck yesterday, even if it didn't look like it at the time." It was too soon to say whether he was right, Clara thought. But sitting in the clean kitchen, watching the last light fade over the desert, she felt something she hadn't expected, a whisper of contentment, fragile as a soap bubble, but real, nonetheless. The days fell into rhythm quickly. Clara rose before dawn to have coffee ready when Jack emerged from his room. They'd share a quick breakfast, then he'd head out to work the ranch while she tended the house. Evenings brought him back dusty and tired, but always appreciative of whatever meals she'd prepared. She attacked the garden with determination, hauling water, working compost into the soil, coaxing life from seeds that seemed determined to resist. Jack watched her efforts with amusement that turned to respect as green shoots began to appear. "You're stubborn," he observed one evening, finding her still working as the sun set. "So is this desert," Clara replied, dirty and exhausted but triumphant over a row of sprouting beans. "Sometimes stubborn meets stubborn, and things grow anyway." Jack laughed at that, a warm sound that had become more frequent in the weeks since Clara's arrival. The transformation of the double M had been gradual, but undeniable curtains now framed the windows. Wildflowers sat in a jar on the kitchen table, and the smell of fresh bread had become as much a part of the ranch as the scent of leather and hay. 3 weeks had passed since that desperate afternoon at the depot, and Clara had almost stopped flinching when she heard wagon wheels on the road, half expecting Thomas Hartley to appear and remind her of her failure. But the only visitors were occasional cattle buyers or neighbors passing through, all of whom seemed surprised to find a woman at the Double M. Jack Mercer's got himself a housekeeper became the talk of Copper Creek, though Clara only heard echoes of it when she accompanied Jack to town for supplies. The whispers followed her through Murphy's general store, but she held her head high, selecting goods with careful attention while Jack loaded feed and equipment. It was on one such trip that everything changed. They just finished at Murphy's when a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Well, if it isn't the unsuitable bride!" Thomas Hartley stood outside his mercantile, dressed in his town finest, a black suit that emphasized his soft middle and pale complexion. Beside him stood another man similarly dressed, but with the predatory look of someone who enjoyed others' discomfort. Clara's hand instinctively found Jack's arm, though she couldn't say whether she sought support or was restraining him from action. She felt the muscles beneath his shirt tense, coiled like a spring ready to release. "Hartley," Jack said, his voice deceptively calm. "Seems to me you said your piece in that letter. No need to say more." "Oh, I think there's plenty more to say," Thomas replied, emboldened by his companion's presence and the gathering crowd of onlookers. "About women who lack the moral fortitude to return home when their situation doesn't work out. Instead, they find other arrangements." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from fury. Before Jack could respond, she stepped forward. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice carrying across the street with surprising clarity, "I find it interesting that you speak of moral fortitude. Tell me, what moral fortitude does it take to court a woman for 6 months, to paint pictures of a future together, to accept her trust and then reject her at first sight because she didn't match whatever fantasy you'd constructed?" Thomas's face reddened. "You were too educated, too opinionated. Too much of a person rather than a possession," Clara interrupted. "Yes, I can see how that would be problematic for a man who needed a woman desperate enough to accept whatever scraps of respect he might throw her way." "Now see here," Thomas's companion began, but Jack shifted slightly, his hand moving to rest near his gun belt. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and the man fell silent. "The lady's speaking," Jack said quietly. "Best let her finish." Clara had never felt power like this, the power of truth spoken aloud, of refusing to be diminished by someone else's smallness. "You offered me half the fare home, knowing it would leave me stranded. You counted on my desperation, my humiliation, perhaps hoping I'd come begging for your charity. Well, Mr. Hartley, I found something better. I found honest work with an honest man who treats me with more respect as his employee than you ever would have as your wife." The crowd had grown shopkeepers and their customers drawn by the spectacle. Among them, Clara recognized several women, their faces showing a mixture of scandal and something that might have been approval. "You're living in his house unchaperoned," Thomas sputtered. "The whole town knows." "The whole town knows I'm keeping house and earning wages," Clara said firmly. "What they choose to think beyond that says more about them than about me. And frankly, Mr. Hartley, after your behavior, I'd rather be thought a fallen woman than the kind of fool who would marry a coward." The word coward seemed to strike Thomas like a physical blow. His face went from red to purple, and he took a step forward, his fist raised. But Jack was already moving, placing himself between Clara and Thomas with a speed that spoke of long practice. "Touch her, and it'll be the last thing you do in this town," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "Maybe the last thing you do, period." Thomas stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. "You can't threaten me. I'll have the sheriff—" "The sheriff who saw your letter?" Jack asked. "The one where you admitted to bringing a woman out here under false pretenses and then abandoning her. Sure, call him. I'm certain he'd be interested in hearing how you're now harassing that same woman for surviving your cruelty." The crowd murmured, and Clara realized that Jack must have shared the contents of the letter with the sheriff, not to cause trouble, but to protect her reputation. The knowledge warmed her more than the desert sun. Thomas looked around, seeking support, but found only curious faces and whispered comments. His companion had already melted away, unwilling to be associated with a losing fight. Finally, with a sound of disgust, Thomas turned and stormed back into his store, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The crowd began to disperse, though not without long looks at Clara and Jack. She heard fragments of conversation. Stood up to him good. About time someone did. That Mercer, he's a decent sort, that suggested the tide of opinion might not be entirely against her. Jack touched her elbow gently. We should go. Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. They walked to the wagon in silence, Jack helping her up with his usual courtesy. It wasn't until they were well outside town that he spoke. That was brave what you did back there. That was necessary, Clara corrected. I couldn't let him make me small. Not again. Jack glanced at her, something warm in his gray eyes. No one could make you small, Clara. You just needed the chance to show how big you really are. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar creak of the wagon and steady clop of hooves soothing Clara's rattled nerves. The confrontation with Thomas had unlocked something in her, not just anger at his treatment, but a recognition of her own strength. She'd crossed half a continent alone, survived abandonment and near destitution, and built a new life from the ashes of her old dreams. Thomas Hartley was just a small man in a small town, and his opinion of her mattered less than dust. Thank you, she said suddenly, for standing with me back there. You didn't need me, Jack replied. You had him dead to rights on your own. Maybe, but it helped knowing you were there. Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, My mother used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear. You've got that kind of courage, Clara. The use of her name spoken with such gentle respect made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. In the weeks since her arrival, she and Jack had developed an easy working relationship, but this felt like something more, a recognition perhaps, or an understanding. As they approached the ranch, Clara noticed a horse tied to the porch rail, a fancy bay mare with silver-studded tack that looked absurdly out of place against the weathered wood. Jack frowned. That's Judge Morrison's horse. What's he doing here? They found Judge Morrison seated in the rocking chair on the porch, a thin man with sharp eyes and graying whiskers that gave him an air of authority even in repose. He stood as they approached, touching his hat to Clara. Jack, Miss Whitmore. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. Judge, Jack said carefully, what brings you out this way? A proposition, actually, but perhaps we should discuss it inside the Sun's Fierce today. Clara made coffee while Jack and the judge settled at the kitchen table. She could feel the judge watching her, assessing though his expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. I'll come straight to the point, Judge Morrison said once they were all seated. I was in town just now, heard about the confrontation with Hartley. Several witnesses gave me their accounts. Clara tensed, wondering if somehow she'd violated some law or social code that would bring trouble to Jack's door. The judge continued, It's made me think about a problem I've been puzzling over. You see, I've been asked to mediate a dispute between two ranchers over water rights. It's complex, involving old Spanish land grants and newer territorial laws. I need someone to help organize the documents, take notes during hearings, perhaps do some research in the land office records. He paused, looking directly at Clara. Someone mentioned you were educated, Miss Whitmore, that you can read and write with facility, perhaps even have some experience with legal documents. I worked for a law firm in St. Louis, Clara said slowly, as a typist and filing clerk. I'm familiar with legal language and documentation, yes. The job would be temporary, perhaps 3 weeks' work, but it pays well, and it would be conducted in full view of the town at the courthouse, completely respectable. The judge glanced at Jack. If you could spare her, that is. Jack leaned back in his chair. That's Clara's decision. We agreed she could take other opportunities if they arose. But Clara heard what he didn't say, that 3 weeks without her help would set him back considerably, just as the ranch was beginning to show improvement. She thought of the garden finally thriving, the house becoming a home, the quiet rhythms they'd established. The pay would be substantial, Judge Morrison added, naming a figure that made Clara's breath catch. It was more than she'd make in 3 months at the ranch. When would you need an answer? Clara asked. By week's end. The hearings begin next Monday. The judge stood. Think it over, Miss Whitmore. It could be a good opportunity to establish yourself in the community as something more than—" He paused delicately. "Well, as a professional woman with valuable skills." After he left, Clara and Jack stood on the porch watching his dust trail disappear toward town. "You should take it," Jack said finally. "It would leave you—" "I managed before you came. I can manage for 3 weeks." But his voice lacked conviction, and Clara could see the weariness already creeping back into his shoulders at the thought. That evening, as Clara served supper, she found herself studying Jack across the table. In the weeks of working alongside him, she'd learned to read his moods, the slight furrow between his brows, when he was worried about the cattle, the way he rubbed his jaw, when puzzling through a problem, the rare but genuine smile when something pleased him. "Tell me about your mother," she said suddenly. Jack looked surprised. "What makes you ask? You mention her sometimes. She must have been special." Jack set down his fork, his eyes going distant. "She was. Strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. She came out here as a young bride, helped my father build this place from nothing. When he died in a stampede, everyone expected her to sell and go back east. Instead, she dug in harder, ran this place herself for 5 years before the cancer took her." "She taught you well," Clara observed. "The way you respect women, treat them as equals, that came from her." "She didn't suffer fools or tolerate disrespect," Jack agreed. "Used to say that the desert didn't care if you were man or woman. It would kill you just the same if you were stupid and let you thrive if you were smart and tough enough." "What would she think of our arrangement?" Jack considered this. "She'd probably say we were both making the best of difficult circumstances. And she'd like you. She had a weakness for fighters." The word fighters hung between them, carrying more weight than its simple meaning. Clara thought of her confrontation with Thomas, of the daily battle to make things grow in the desert soil, of Jack's lonely struggle to keep the ranch afloat. "I'm not taking the judge's offer, she said quietly. Jack's head came up sharply. "Clara, you don't need to—" "I know I don't need to, but this is where I'm needed right now. The money would be nice, yes, but leaving you to manage alone when we're finally making progress." She shook her head. "That's not the kind of person I want to be. The town might respect you more if you took it. Working for a judge carries weight." "The town will respect me or not based on their own prejudices," Clara replied. "I can't live my life chasing their approval. I'd rather earn my own respect by honoring my commitments." Jack was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the table to briefly squeeze her hand. "Thank you." The simple gesture and words carried more meaning than any elaborate speech. Clara felt something shift between them, subtle but significant. A deepening of trust, perhaps, or the first recognition of something that might grow beyond mere partnership. The next morning brought a new crisis. Clara woke to the sound of distressed cattle and Jack's voice raised in alarm. She dressed quickly and ran outside to find him in the nearest corral, kneeling beside a prone calf. "Rattlesnake," he said tersely. "Got him in the leg. He's going into shock." The calf was barely breathing, its eyes rolled back, leg swelling rapidly, where 2 puncture marks showed dark against the hide. "What do you need?" Clara asked, dropping to her knees beside him. "Knife from the kitchen, whiskey from the cabinet, and clean rags. Hurry." She ran, gathering the items with efficiency born of urgency. When she returned, Jack was already working to keep the calf calm, speaking to it in low, soothing tones that seemed at odds with the tension in his body. "Hold his head," Jack instructed. "Keep him as still as possible." Clara cradled the calf's head in her lap, feeling its rapid, shallow breathing against her hands. Jack worked quickly, making careful incisions near the bite marks, using his mouth to draw out venom and spitted aside a dangerous procedure that could poison him if he had any cuts in his mouth. "There's a better way," Clara said suddenly, remembering something from a medical text she'd once filed. "The beacon kit. Some doctors use it for snake bites. Do you have a glass jar and leather?" "In the workshop," Jack said, still working. But Clara was already running. She found what she needed and improvised a suction device using the jar to create vacuum pressure over the wound. Jack watched with surprise as she worked her movements, confident despite her shaking hands. For an hour they fought for the calf's life, taking turns with the suction cleaning the wound, forcing water down its throat when it could swallow. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them mercilessly, but neither suggested stopping. Finally, the calf's breathing steadied. Its eyes focused, and it tried weakly to stand. "Easy, little one," Jack murmured, helping it to its feet. The leg was still swollen, but no longer the angry purple it had been. "You'll make it now." They watched as the calf limped to its mother, who had been lowing anxiously at the fence line. The reunion was touching the mother immediately, beginning to clean her offspring with careful attention. "Where did you learn that, son?" Jack asked, looking at Clara with new appreciation. "I read a lot," Clara said, suddenly self-conscious. "The law firm had medical techs 2 injury cases. I remember things. You saved his life. That suction trick, I've never seen it work so well." "We saved his life," Clara corrected. "I couldn't have done anything without your quick action." They were both covered in dirt and blood, exhausted from the morning's crisis. But as they walked back to the house, Clara felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended the physical discomfort. This was real work, vital work, not just keeping house, but keeping life going in a harsh land. "You continually surprise me," Jack said as they reached the porch. "Every time I think I have you figured out, you show another layer. Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said softly. "It's not bad at all." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Jack cleared his throat, stepping back. "I should check the other pastures for snakes. Can't be too careful this time of year." Clara watched him go, aware that something had shifted again. The careful distance they'd maintained, the professional boundaries of employer and employee, were beginning to blur. She thought she should be concerned about that, but found instead a warm anticipation, as if something long dormant was beginning to wake. That afternoon, while Jack was out checking fence lines, Clara had another visitor. A woman approached on foot, her dress dusty from the walk, but her bearing dignified despite the heat. Clara recognized her from town, Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, a woman whose opinion carried significant social weight in Copper Creek. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Davies said formally. "Might I have a word?" Clara invited her in, serving cold tea flavored with mint from her recovering garden. Mrs. Davies sat primly at the kitchen table, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the spotless room. "I'll be direct," Mrs. Davies began. "Your presence here has caused quite a stir in town." "I'm aware," Clara said evenly. "Some people, my husband among them, believe you're a bad influence. A woman living unchaperoned with a bachelor, regardless of the circumstance, sets a poor example." Clara felt her temper rise, but kept her voice calm. "And what do you believe, Mrs. Davies?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, then surprising Clara with a small smile. "I believe that 20 years ago I was in a similar situation. Different circumstances, but similar judgment from the town. I was a widow with 2 small children, and I took a position as secretary to the man who would become my husband. The scandal was considerable. What changed their minds? Time, consistent behavior, and eventually the recognition that what 2 adults arrange between themselves, as long as it's legal and harms no one, is their own business." Mrs. Davies set down her teacup. "I came to warn you that my husband and others may try to make things difficult. But I also came to say that not everyone in town agrees with them. Some of us remember what it's like to be judged unfairly." "Why tell me this?" "Because I saw you stand up to Thomas Hartley yesterday. It took courage. And because Jack Mercer is a good man who deserves happiness whatever form it takes." She stood to leave, then paused. "There's to be a church social next Sunday. It would be good if you both attended. Together, but not together, if you understand my meaning." Clara did understand. Show up as part of the community, but maintain appropriate boundaries. Display respectability while refusing to hide. "We'll consider it," Clara said carefully. After Mrs. Davies left, Clara stood at the window, watching the dust settle from her departure. The visit had been unexpected, but oddly encouraging. Not everyone in Copper Creek was against her. She had potential allies if she was careful and patient. When Jack returned that evening, she told him about both visits, her refusal of the judge's offer, and Mrs. Davies's warning and invitation. "A church social," Jack said with distaste. "Haven't been to one of those in years." "It might help," Clara suggested. "Show the town we have nothing to hide." "We don't have anything to hide," Jack said firmly. "Our arrangement is honest and above board. You and I know that, but perception matters, especially if they're going to try to make trouble for you." Jack was quiet, then said, "It's not trouble for me I'm worried about. It's you. Your reputation was ruined the moment Thomas abandoned me at the depot," Clara interrupted. "I'm a fallen woman in their eyes, regardless of the truth. But I can be a respectable fallen woman if I play this right." Jack laughed despite himself. "Only you could make that sound like a battle strategy. Isn't it? The battlefield is just social instead of physical." Sunday came too quickly. Clara dressed carefully in her second-best dress. The blue silk she'd pushed to the back of the wardrobe was still too painful to wear. She arranged her hair simply but elegantly, wanting to look respectable but not as if she were trying too hard. Jack emerged from his room in clothes she'd never seen a proper suit that must have been saved for special occasions. It fit him well, despite being a few years out of fashion, and Clara found herself staring at the transformation. "You clean up well," she said, then blushed at the familiarity of the comment. "So do you," Jack replied, his eyes warm with appreciation. "Though you always look nice." The compliment hung between them more personal than their usual exchanges. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with unnecessary adjustments to her gloves. They rode to town in the wagon, maintaining careful distance on the bench seat. The church was already filling when they arrived, families in their Sunday best gathering in small groups. Conversation slowed as Clara and Jack approached eyes following their progress. "Remember," Jack murmured, "we're here as members of the community, nothing more or less." They separated inside the church, Jack taking a seat near the back with other ranchers, while Clara found a place among the unmarried women. She felt their scrutiny like a physical weight, but kept her head high, focusing on the hymnal in her hands. The service itself was unremarkable, though Clara noticed the minister's sermon about virtue and propriety seemed particularly pointed. She maintained a serene expression, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. The real test came at the social afterward, held in the field beside the church. Long tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes, and children ran between the adults playing games. It was a scene of normal community life, one Clara had imagined being part of, as Thomas Hartley's wife. She helped serve food, falling into easy conversation with some of the women about recipes and gardening. Several seemed surprised by her knowledge and normal demeanor, as if they'd expected something more scandalous from a fallen woman. "Your garden's coming along well, I hear," said Mrs. Murphy from the general store. "Jack mentioned you've got beans and tomatoes already sprouting." "The soil needs work, but it's responding," Claire replied. "I've been adding compost and working in what organic matter I can find." "My roses are struggling this year," another woman added. "What would you suggest?" Soon Clara found herself in an animated discussion about desert gardening, other women chiming in with their own challenges and successes. It was so normal, so mundane that she almost forgot she was supposed to be a social pariah. Then Thomas Hartley arrived with a woman on his arm, young pretty in a China doll way, and obviously overwhelmed by the attention. His new mail-order bride Clara realized with a jolt. "Ladies," Thomas said smoothly, approaching their group, "I'd like you to meet Miss Sarah Collins soon to be Mrs. Hartley. She's just arrived from Chicago." The women murmured greetings, but Clara saw the fear in Sarah's eyes, the same fear she'd felt stepping off that train. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Miss Collins," she said warmly, "welcome to Copper Creek. I hope your journey wasn't too arduous." Sarah blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting kindness from any quarter. "It was long, but I'm glad to be here." Thomas's face darkened. "Sarah doesn't need advice from someone who's been through the transition," Clara interrupted smoothly. "Of course not. But should you need anything, Miss Collins, recommendations for dress goods, help with adjusting to the climate, or just someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to ask." It was a calculated kindness, one that positioned Clara as helpful rather than bitter, gracious rather than defeated. She saw several women nod approvingly, and even Thomas seemed momentarily off balance. "That's very kind," Sarah said softly. "I appreciate it." Clara excused herself, moving away before Thomas could recover. She found Jack near the drinks table, his expression unreadable. "That was well played," he said quietly. "She's scared," Clara replied. "I remember that feeling. No one should face it alone. Even though she's taking what was supposed to be yours." Clara looked across the field to where Thomas was steering Sarah away from the other women, already controlling her movements and interactions. She's not taking anything I want. I see that now. Jack followed her gaze. He won't treat her well. No, he won't. But maybe the women here will help her the way Mrs. Davies helped me understand things. She paused. Is that wrong of me, to be grateful I escaped that fate? Nothing wrong with recognizing a bullet dodged, Jack said, or with being kind to someone else in the line of fire. They were interrupted by Judge Morrison, who approached with purposeful strides. Miss Whitmore, I heard you decline my offer. I did, Your Honor, but I appreciate the consideration. The position is still open if you change your mind. In fact, he glanced meaningfully at Jack. I might be able to arrange for evening hours so you could maintain your current position as well. It was a generous offer, one that would allow her to have both incomes and greater respectability. Clara felt Jack tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. That's very kind, Clara said carefully. Might I have a few days to consider? Of course, but I'll need an answer by Tuesday. The hearings really can't be delayed further. After the judge walked away, Clara and Jack stood in awkward silence. Around them, the social continued children's laughter, adult conversation, the normal sounds of community life that seemed to exclude them even as they stood in its midst. You should take it, Jack said finally. Evening hours would work. Would they? You come in exhausted most nights. When would I have energy for legal work after managing the house all day? We could make it work. Why are you so eager for me to take this job? Claire asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Jack was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, Because I don't want you to stay out of obligation. If you stay, I want it to be because you choose to, not because you feel trapped. The honesty of it took Claire's breath away. She wanted to tell him that she'd stopped feeling trapped weeks ago, that the ranch had become home in ways she hadn't expected. But the words wouldn't come, not here with half the town watching their every interaction. We should go, she said instead. It's getting late. The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they reached the ranch, the setting sun painted everything golden, the house, the barn, the garden with its promising green shoots. It was beautiful in its simplicity, honest in its purpose. I'm not taking the judge's job, Clara said as Jack helped her down from the wagon. Not the evening hours, not any of it. Clara, I choose to stay, she said firmly, meeting his eyes. Not from obligation, not from lack of options, but because this is where I want to be. This work, this life, it means something. I'm building something here, same as you are. Jack stood very still, his hand still on her waist from helping her down. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with possibility, with weeks of careful distance suddenly collapsing. Then a coyote howled in the distance, breaking the spell, and Jack stepped back. Thank you, he said simply, but his eyes said more, spoke of gratitude and relief, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds, so much brighter than they'd ever been in St. Louis. She thought about choices, the ones forced on us and the ones we make freely. Coming west had been desperation. Staying with Jack had been survival. But choosing to remain to build a life here despite other options, that was freedom. The morning after the church social brought an unexpected cold snap unusual for late spring in Arizona. Clara woke to find frost on the garden, her carefully nurtured plants wilting under the crystalline assault. She rushed outside in her wrapper and boots, an undignified sight that would have scandalized the town, but saving the vegetables took precedence over propriety. Jack found her there frantically covering the tender shoots with whatever fabric she could find, old sheets, worn blankets, even her own shawl. Here, he said, handing her a pile of burlap sacks from the barn. These work better. They breathe but still hold warmth. Together they worked to save what they could, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. By the time the sun rose high enough to chase away the frost, they'd managed to protect most of the garden, though some casualties were inevitable. I'm sorry, Clara said, looking at the damaged tomato plant she couldn't save. I should have seen this coming, prepared better. Clara, I've lived here my whole life, and this frost caught me off guard, Jack assured her. You can't predict everything the desert throws at you. You just respond as best you can. It seemed a metaphor for more than gardening, and Clara found comfort in his practical wisdom. They stood together surveying the damage and the saved plant, shoulders almost touching, comfortable in shared purpose. We make a good team, Jack said quietly. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the road, moving with the purposeful pace of men on business rather than social calls. Jack's expression hardened. That's Ben Davies, the banker, and Sheriff Watson. Don't recognize the third man. Clara felt dread pool in her stomach. Mrs. Davies had warned her that her husband might cause trouble, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Miss Whitmore, Davies called out without dismounting his tone, making her name sound like an accusation. We need to discuss your situation here. What situation would that be? Jack asked, stepping slightly in front of Clara. The improper living arrangement that's causing scandal in our community, Davies replied. I'm here in my capacity as a concerned citizen and member of the town council. The third man, who had the oily look of a city lawyer, pulled out a document. There are laws about moral turpitude, Mr. Mercer. Cohabitation without marriage falls under such statutes. She's my employee, Jack said firmly. She keeps house and maintains the garden in exchange for room, board, and wages. Nothing improper about it. That's not how the town sees it, Davies countered. And perception matters. We're prepared to offer Miss Whitmore a solution. There's a boarding house in Tucson that takes in wayward women, helps them find respectable positions in larger cities where their past isn't known. Wayward women. Clara stepped around Jack, her anger overcoming her caution. I'm a woman earning an honest living, Mr. Davies. If that makes me wayward in your eyes, perhaps you should examine your own moral vision. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, Miss Whitmore, no one wants trouble, but the town council has concerns about the example being set. What example? That a woman can survive abandonment and build a respectable life through hard work? Claire's voice carried across the yard. Or is the real concern that I didn't crawl away in shame when Thomas Hartley discarded me like unwanted goods? You're living with a man without benefit of marriage, Davies stated flatly. That's the bottom line. I'm working for a man who treats me with more respect than any of you fine, upstanding citizens have shown, Clara retorted. Including you, Mr. Davies, who's so concerned about propriety that you drive a woman from honest employment into who knows what desperate circumstances. The lawyer started to speak again, but Jack cut him off. You have no legal standing here. This is my property. She's my employee. And unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, not gossip, not speculation, but evidence, you're trespassing. We could make things difficult for you, Mercer, Davies warned. Your loans at the bank, for instance. Jack laughed, but it was a hard sound. My loans are current, always have been. You try to call them in without cause, and every rancher in the valley will pull their money from your bank. They might not approve of my domestic arrangements, but they sure as hell won't stand for a banker using his position to settle personal grudges. It was a valid threat. The ranchers depended on fair banking practices, and any sign of Davies using his power vindictively would unite them against him. The sheriff cleared his throat. Perhaps we could find a compromise. Miss Whitmore could maintain her position but reside in town. The widow Patterson has rooms to let. And how would I manage the early morning chores, the evening meals, the 100 daily tasks that require presence? Clara asked. Not to mention the additional expense of room rental that would consume most of my wages. That's not our concern, Davies said coldly. No, your concern is control, Clara shot back. You can't stand that a woman you consider fallen refuses to act ashamed, refuses to hide, refuses to beg for your approval. Clara, Jack said quietly, a warning in his tone. But she was past caution, past careful diplomacy. You want to know what's truly scandalous, Mr. Davies? It's that you'd rather see me destitute than employed. That you'd rather maintain your narrow view of propriety than allow 2 adults to make an honest business arrangement. That's the real moral turpitude here. Davies' face had gone purple with rage. You dare to lecture me on morality. Someone needs to, Clara said steadily. Because your version seems more concerned with appearance than actual virtue. The lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently to Davies, probably warning him about the shaky legal ground they stood on. Davies listened, his expression growing more frustrated. Finally, he straightened in his saddle. "This isn't over, Miss Whitmore. The town council will be meeting to discuss this matter formally. Then I expect to be notified officially and given opportunity to speak in my own defense," Clara said. "That is the legal requirement, isn't it?" The lawyer looked surprised that she knew this, but nodded reluctantly. "Yes, you have that right." "Then, gentlemen, unless you have further business, I'll ask you to leave. I have work to do." They rode away, but Clara could see from their postures that this was indeed far from over. She stood watching until they disappeared from view, then found her legs suddenly shaky. Jack's hand on her elbow steadied her. "Come inside. You need to sit down." He guided her to the kitchen, pouring her coffee with hands that she noticed were not quite steady either. "That was either very brave or very foolish." "Both probably," Clara admitted. "But I couldn't let them bulldoze us." "Us," Jack repeated softly. "You said us." Clara looked up at him, realizing what she'd revealed. "We are in this together, aren't we? Your reputation is suffering too because of me." "My reputation was that of a hermit who couldn't keep help before you arrived," Jack said with wry humor. "If anything, you've improved it by showing I'm capable of normal human interaction." Despite everything, Clara laughed. "Is that what we have, normal human interaction?" Jack's eyes met hers, and for a moment the kitchen felt too small, too warm. "Nothing about you is normal, Clara Whitmore, and I mean that as the highest compliment." Before she could respond, he stood abruptly. "I need to check the cattle. That frost might have damaged more than the garden." He paused at the door. "Don't worry about Davies. We'll handle whatever comes." After he left, Clara sat alone in the kitchen, aware that something fundamental had shifted. The threat from town had pushed them from careful professional distance into something closer to alliance, even partnership. The us had slipped out naturally because that's how it felt them against the world, or at least against the narrow-minded portion of it represented by Ben Davies. She threw herself into work, channeling her anxiety into productive action. By the time Jack returned for the noon meal, she had bread-rising soup simmering, and had even managed to salvage some of the frost-damaged vegetables for pickling. "Smells like heaven in here," Jack said, washing up at the basin. "Productive anger," Clara explained. "My mother always said if you're going to be mad, might as well get something done with all that energy." Wise woman. Is she still in St. Louis? It was the first time Jack had asked about her family, and Clara found herself wanting to share. "She passed 5 years ago. Consumption. My father had died 2 years before that in a factory accident." "I'm sorry, that must have been hard." "It was. But it also taught me to be self-sufficient. When you have no one to catch you, you learn not to fall." "Everyone falls sometimes," Jack said gently. "The trick is learning to get back up." "Speaking from experience," Jack nodded slowly. "My father's death nearly broke this place. We had debts, no help, and everyone expected us to fail. My mother refused to give up, and she taught me the same stubbornness, but there were times—" He trailed off, lost in memory. "Tell me," Clara encouraged. "There was a winter about 7 years ago. Worst freeze we'd ever had. Lost half the herd. I was ready to sell, take whatever I could get, and start over somewhere else. Mother was already sick by then, though we didn't know how bad yet. She made me promise to give it 1 more year, said the land deserved that much loyalty. And you stayed." "I stayed. That next year was better. Not great, but better. And the year after that, better still. She lived just long enough to see the ranch stabilize." Jack's voice roughened with emotion. "She died, knowing I'd keep it going." Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "She'd be proud of what you've built here." Jack turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. "I think she'd like you. You have her kind of strength." They sat there for a moment, hands linked across the table, the simple touch carrying more intimacy than any embrace. Then, as if suddenly aware of what they were doing, they pulled apart simultaneously. "I should—" Jack started. "Yes, and I need to," Clara said at the same time. They both stopped, laughed awkwardly, and Jack fled to the barn while Clara busied herself with unnecessary cleaning, but the memory of his calloused palm against hers lingered like warmth from a fire. 2 days later, a formal notice arrived from the town council. Clara was to appear before them at the end of the week to address concerns about moral standards and community welfare. The language was deliberately vague, but the threat clear. "I'll hire a lawyer," Jack said immediately upon reading it. "That fellow from Tucson who helped with the water rights last year." "No," Clara said firmly. "That would make it look like we have something to hide. I'll represent myself." "Clara, these men don't play fair. They'll twist your words, use the law against you." "Then I'll use it right back." She went to her room and returned with a stack of papers. "I've been doing research. There's no law against a woman working as a housekeeper regardless of whether she lives in or out. The moral turpitude laws they're referencing require proof of actual impropriety, not just suspicious circumstances." Jack looked at the papers with surprise. "When did you do all this?" "The past 2 nights. Couldn't sleep anyway." She'd spent hours by lamplight remembering everything she'd learned at the law firm, writing arguments and counter-arguments. "You're remarkable," Jack said quietly. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm prepared. There's a difference." The day of the hearing arrived too quickly. Clara dressed in her most conservative outfit, pinning her hair severely back. She looked like a schoolmarm or a spinster aunt, deliberately unseductive, almost militantly respectable. Jack insisted on accompanying her despite her protests that it might make things worse. "I'm not letting you face those wolves alone." The town hall was packed. It seemed everyone in Copper Creek had found a reason to attend this routine council meeting. Clara saw Mrs. Davies in the back, her expression unreadable. Judge Morrison sat to one side, not part of the council, but clearly there as an observer. Even Thomas Hartley had come with his new fiancée, looking uncomfortable beside him. Ben Davies called the meeting to order with obvious relish. "We're here to address concerns about Miss Clara Whitmore's living situation and its impact on the moral fabric of our community." "I object to the characterization," Clara said, standing. "If we're to have a hearing, let it be factual, not prejudicial." Davies's eyes narrowed. "You're not a lawyer, Miss Whitmore." "No, but I'm an American citizen with rights, including the right to fair treatment under the law." She pulled out her papers. "Which specific statute am I accused of violating?" The council members looked at each other uncertainly. Finally, one of them said, "The territorial laws regarding lewd and lascivious behavior." "Which requires proof of actual improper conduct," Clara countered. "What evidence do you have beyond the fact of my employment?" "You're living unchaperoned with a bachelor," Davies stated. "I'm working as a housekeeper. Many women in this town have done the same when widowed or in need of income. Mrs. Johnson worked for the Taylors for 3 years. Mrs. Creek kept house for old Mr. Barnett until he died. Were they investigated for moral turpitude?" "Those were different circumstances," Davies argued. "How?" "Because those women were older, because they were widows rather than abandoned fiancés." "Show me the legal distinction." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "If I may interject, the young lady has a point. The law doesn't differentiate based on age or previous marital status." Davies shot him a furious look, but couldn't argue with the judge's legal interpretation. Clara pressed her advantage. "Furthermore, I have here 3 signed statements from businesses in town confirming that Mr. Mercer and I conduct ourselves with complete propriety in all public interactions. I have a statement from Mrs. Davies herself. Yes, your wife, Mr. Davies, attesting to the respectability of my character based on her visit to the ranch." Davies went white. "My wife had no authority." "She has the authority of her own observations and conscience," Clara interrupted. "Unless you're saying a wife's testimony is worthless." It was a trap, and Davies knew it. To dismiss his wife's statement would undermine his own household authority and anger the women in the crowd. Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I also have here a copy of Mr. Hartley's letter abandoning me without cause or proper provision. If we're discussing moral turpitude, perhaps we should examine the actions of a man who brings a woman across the country under false pretenses and then discards her like unwanted merchandise." Thomas started to stand, but his fiancée pulled him back down, whispering urgently in his ear. Clara noticed the girl's expression, not embarrassment, but calculation. Perhaps Miss Sarah Collins was learning quickly about the true nature of her intended. "The point is," Clara said, addressing the full room now rather than just the council, I came to this town in good faith, prepared to contribute to this community as a wife and citizen. When that opportunity was cruelly withdrawn, I found honest work that allows me to survive with dignity. If that offends you, then perhaps you should examine why a woman's honest labor is more scandalous to you than a man's dishonest dealings. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Clara saw several women nodding in agreement. One of the other council members, a Mr. Peterson, who ran the feed store, spoke up. Miss Whitmore, would you consider the compromise suggested earlier, maintaining your position but residing in town? Clara had prepared for this. Mr. Peterson, the ranch is 5 miles from town. To arrive in time to prepare breakfast and tend the early chores, I would need to leave town at 4 in the morning, traveling alone in the dark. To return after preparing supper and completing evening tasks, I would be traveling again in darkness, arriving in town well after 9 o'clock. Which is more improper, residing safely at my place of employment or traveling unescorted in darkness twice daily? Peterson had no answer for that. Judge Morrison stood. If I may address the council, it seems to me that Miss Whitmore has demonstrated that no laws have been broken, no actual impropriety has occurred, and that the proposed alternatives would actually create more dangerous and potentially compromising situations. Unless the council has evidence, not suspicion, not gossip, but evidence of wrongdoing, I see no legal grounds for any action against Miss Whitmore or Mr. Mercer. Davies looked like he wanted to argue, but the judge's intervention carried too much weight to dismiss. The other council members were already looking uncomfortable, aware that they were on shaky ground. Finally, grudgingly, Davies said, "The council will take the matter under advisement. This hearing is adjourned." As people filed out, Clara felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Jack's hand at her elbow steadied her, and she was grateful for his solid presence. Outside, they were surrounded by well-wishers, mostly women who admired her courage in standing up to the council. Even Mrs. Davies approached, giving her husband a defiant look. "Well spoken, Miss Whitmore," she said quietly. "Sometimes the truth needs a clear voice." Thomas Hartley pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. "You had no right to share my private correspondence. You had no right to abandon her without means of survival," Jack said, stepping between them. "I'd say that makes you even." Thomas looked between them, his expression ugly. "This isn't over. You've made an enemy today." "I made an enemy the day you left me standing at that depot," Clara said quietly. "Today I just stopped pretending otherwise." Thomas stormed off, dragging his bewildered fiancée with him. Clara watched them go, feeling not triumph, but a tired sort of pity. Sarah Collins would learn soon enough what kind of man she'd attached herself to. Judge Morrison approached as the crowd dispersed. "That was impressively argued, Miss Whitmore. If you ever reconsider my offer of employment, it stands." "Thank you, Your Honor, but I'm content where I am." The judge looked between her and Jack, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "Yes, I rather thought you might be." The ride home was quiet at first, both of them processing the events of the afternoon. Finally, Jack said, "You were magnificent in there, like a lawyer yourself." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "My hands were shaking the entire time." "Couldn't tell. You looked like you were born to stand up to bullies." "Maybe I was. I just needed the right opportunity to discover it." Jack glanced at her, something warm and admiring in his expression. "I'm glad you discovered it here." They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. As Jack helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Clara," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with words. "I need to say something." She waited, heart beating rapidly. "When you first arrived, I offered you a job out of, I don't know, sympathy maybe, or recognition of a fellow soul in trouble. But somewhere along the way you became," he paused, searching for words, "essential. Not just for the work you do, but for who you are. The ranch feels alive again with you here. I feel alive again." Clara's breath caught. "Jack, I'm not asking for anything," he continued quickly. "I know the position that would put you in, especially after today, but I needed you to know that you're not just an employee to me. You haven't been for a while now." Clara looked up at him, seeing vulnerability in those steady gray eyes. "You're not just an employer to me either," she said softly. "When I stood up there today defending my right to be here, it wasn't just about the job. It was about this place, this life we've built together. It was about you. Jack's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. Clara, A coyote's howl interrupted closer than usual, and they heard the cattle stirring restlessly. Jack's hand dropped the moment broken by the demands of ranch life. I should check on them, he said reluctantly. And I should start supper, Clara replied, though neither moved immediately. Finally, Jack stepped back. We have time, he said quietly. Whatever this is between us, we have time to figure it out. Clara nodded, understanding. They'd won today's battle, but the war for acceptance and respectability was far from over. Adding a romantic complication now would only give their enemies more ammunition. But as she prepared supper, she found herself humming something she hadn't done since her mother died. The ranch kitchen felt like home. Jack's presence in the barn was a comfort rather than a complication, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. That night she heard Jack pacing in his room, the floorboards creaking under his restless movement. She understood the feeling. Everything between them had shifted, acknowledged, but not acted upon, present, but not pursued. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience neither of them naturally possessed. But they would manage it, Clara thought. They'd learn to work together, to trust each other, to build something worthwhile from the ruins of their separate disappointments. Whatever came next, whether from the town's continued disapproval or their own growing feelings, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together, with courage, and with the stubborn determination that the desert itself had taught them. The week following the council hearing passed in careful normalcy, as if both Clara and Jack had silently agreed to maintain their routines while processing what had been said between them. But the very air seemed charged with awareness, every accidental touch, as they passed in the kitchen, every shared glance across the supper table carried weight that hadn't existed before. It was during this delicate time that the letter arrived. Clara found it tucked under the door one morning, her name written in unfamiliar script. No postmark, meaning it had been delivered by hand. She opened it with trembling fingers, half expecting another threat from Davies or the council. Instead, she found herself staring at elegant handwriting that made her blood run cold. My dear Miss Whitmore, I am Mrs. Eleanor Hartley Thomas's mother. I have recently arrived in Copper Creek to attend my son's wedding, and I find myself troubled by certain circumstances I've discovered. I would very much like to speak with you privately. If you're willing, please meet me at the Imperial Hotel this afternoon at 2 o'clock. I believe we may have interests in common. Yours in concern, Eleanor Hartley. Clara read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. What could Thomas's mother possibly want with her? Was this another attempt to drive her from town or something else entirely? She found Jack in the barn mending a bridle. He looked up at her approach, immediately noting her expression. What's wrong? She handed him the letter wordlessly. Jack read it, his frown deepening. This feels like a trap, he said. Maybe. But I'm curious what she wants. Thomas has been telling everyone I'm a fallen woman who tried to trap him into marriage. Why would his mother want to meet with me? To convince you to leave town before the wedding, Jack suggested, or to gather more ammunition against you. Clara considered this. Possibly, but the tone of the letter, it doesn't feel hostile, it feels worried. You're not thinking of going, I think I have to. If I don't, I'll always wonder what she wanted. Jack set down the bridle, his full attention on her now. Then I'm coming with you. Jack, that would only make things worse. A private meeting between 2 women is one thing. You being there would add fuel to the gossip. He clearly wanted to argue, but recognized the truth in her words. At least let me drive you to town. I'll wait at Murphy's while you meet with her. Clara agreed, grateful for the compromise. As she dressed for town, she wondered what Eleanor Hartley could possibly want. The woman had traveled from Kansas City for her son's wedding. Surely she hadn't come early just to confront her son's rejected bride. The Imperial Hotel's parlor was nearly empty when Clara arrived. She spotted Eleanor Hartley immediately, an elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that reminded Clara uncomfortably of her son. But where Thomas's gaze was often cruel or dismissive, his mother's held a different quality assessment, perhaps, and something that might have been concern. Miss Whitmore? Eleanor rose, extending a gloved hand. Thank you for coming. Please sit. I've ordered tea. Clara sat carefully maintaining her guard despite the woman's polite demeanor. Mrs. Hartley, forgive my directness, but why did you want to see me? Eleanor smiled slightly. I see the frontier has taught you to dispense with social niceties. Good. We don't have time for elaborate dances around the truth. She poured tea with steady hands. I wanted to meet the woman my son abandoned at the train depot. Why? Because it's not the first time he's done something like this, and I'm afraid it won't be the last. Clara nearly dropped her teacup. I beg your pardon? Eleanor sighed, suddenly looking older. Thomas has always been difficult. Selfish, I suppose, though it pains me to say it about my own son. His father spoiled him terribly, and I was too weak to counter it. This is the result of a man who sees women as possessions to be acquired and discarded at will. Mrs. Hartley, why are you telling me this? Because I've met Miss Collins, his new intended. She's young, innocent, and completely unprepared for what my son truly is. I watched him with her, controlling her every movement, dismissing her opinions, treating her like a pretty doll rather than a person. Eleanor met Clara's eyes directly. I think you escaped a terrible fate, Miss Whitmore. I'm afraid Miss Collins won't be so fortunate. Clara set down her tea, trying to process this unexpected confession. Are you asking me to warn her? I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what happened. Thomas's version paints you as a gold digger who misrepresented herself. But I've made inquiries. You worked for Brennan and Associates in St. Louis, a respectable firm. You come from a good family, albeit one that fell on hard times. You're educated, well-spoken, and by all accounts of good character. So why did my son really reject you? Clara was quiet for a moment, then decided on honesty. He said I was too educated, too outspoken, that I wouldn't suit the simple life of a merchant's wife. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Too educated? God forbid a woman have thoughts of her own. And now he's chosen a girl who's barely finished school, who agrees with everything he says out of fear rather than affection. What do you want from me, Mrs. Hartley? I want to know if there's any way to stop this wedding without destroying the girl's reputation in the process. She's trapped, came here on his promise just as you did, but unlike you, she has no spine to stand on her own. If the wedding is called off, she'll be ruined. Clara thought of Sarah Collins's frightened eyes at the church social. Have you spoken to her? I've tried. She's terrified of displeasing Thomas, won't say a word against him. But I see the fear in her eyes. I recognize it. I saw it in my mirror for years when his father was alive. The admission hung heavy between them. Clara suddenly understood that Eleanor Hartley had her own history of enduring a controlling man and was watching her son repeat the pattern. I don't know how I can help, Clara said carefully. My position in this town is precarious at best. Anything I say against Thomas would be dismissed as jealousy or spite. I know, I'm not asking you to intervene directly. I suppose I'm asking if you know of any legal way to protect the girl. You worked at a law firm. Surely there must be something, Clara thought carefully. There are laws about marriage under false pretenses, but they're hard to prove and rarely enforced, unless Miss Collins herself wants to break the engagement. She's too scared. She has nothing to return to. She was an orphan working in a factory. This seemed like salvation to her. Clara felt a pang of sympathy. There, but for the grace of God and Jack Mercer's kindness, went she. There might be another way, Clara said slowly. But it would require your help, and it might damage your relationship with your son permanently. My relationship with Thomas is already damaged. Has been since I finally stood up to his father, and he took his side. Eleanor leaned forward. What are you thinking? You could offer Miss Collins an alternative. Employment as your companion, perhaps? A respectable position that would give her options beyond marriage? Eleanor's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. She couldn't refuse without admitting she doesn't want to marry Thomas, and if she accepts, she'd have legitimate reason to postpone the wedding. You'd have to be careful how you present it, Clara warned. Thomas would be suspicious if it seems like you're trying to separate them. I'll say I need help with my health. My heart has been troubling me, which is true enough. I'll insist I need a companion immediately, and that I've taken a liking to Sarah. Eleanor grasped Clara's hand suddenly. Thank you. This gives me hope. Don't thank me yet. It might not work. But it's something. Eleanor squeezed her hand before releasing it. I owe you an apology as well. For my son's behavior, for what he put you through. You're not responsible for his actions. No, but I'm responsible for the man he became. I should have been stronger, should have protected him from his father's influence instead of just trying to survive it myself. Clara saw tears gathering in the older woman's eyes and felt an unexpected kinship. How many women suffered in silence, trapped by circumstances and social expectations? Mrs. Hartley, Clara said gently, you're trying to protect Sarah now. That counts for something. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. You're very kind, especially considering how my son treated you. I hear you're working for Jack Mercer now. Yes, as his housekeeper. Eleanor studied her for a moment. Just his housekeeper? Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her voice steady. Mr. Mercer has been nothing but professional and respectful. I didn't mean to imply otherwise, it's just, I knew Jack's mother, Mary. We were friends before she passed. She would have liked you. You have her same strength, her refusal to be broken by this harsh land. You knew her. Oh, yes. She was the one who helped me find my backbone, actually. When things with Thomas's father were at their worst, Mary would invite me to tea and remind me that I was stronger than I knew. She faced her own hardships with such grace, losing her husband, raising Jack alone, fighting to keep the ranch. She never complained, just did what needed doing. Clara found herself hungry for these glimpses of the woman who had shaped Jack. What else was she like? Eleanor smiled. Stubborn as a mule and twice as determined. She could make anything grow in that desert soil, had a gift for it, and she loved her son fiercely. She used to say Jack would find his match someday, a woman who could stand beside him as an equal partner, not behind him as a shadow. The words resonated deeply, and Clara wondered if Mary Mercer would have approved of her presence at the Double M. I should go, Clara said, aware that she'd been away longer than planned. Thank you for the tea and for your honesty. Thank you for your help with Sarah and Miss Whitmore, Eleanor called as Clara stood to leave. Don't let the town's narrow minds drive you away. From what I've heard, you're exactly what the Double M needs, what Jack needs. Clara left the hotel with her thoughts churning. She found Jack at Murphy's as promised, helping load supplies for another rancher. He immediately abandoned the task when he saw her searching her face for signs of distress. How did it go? Not what I expected, Clara said, and explained the conversation as they drove home. Jack whistled low. So Thomas comes by his nature honestly. His father was a bastard too. His mother is trying to make amends. I feel sorry for her. And for the Collins girl. Though if Mrs. Hartley's plan works, she might escape Thomas's trap. They rode in contemplative silence for a while. Then Jack said, She knew my mother. Yes, they were friends. She said your mother would have liked me. Jack glanced at her, something soft in his expression. She would have. You're alike in many ways, strong, determined, not willing to let anyone make you feel small. Your mother sounds remarkable. She was. After Pa died, everyone expected her to remarry quickly or sell the ranch. Instead, she learned to rope cattlemen fences and negotiate with buyers who thought they could cheat a widow. She taught me that needing help doesn't make you weak, and that giving help doesn't make you superior. Is that why you helped me? Jack was quiet for a moment. Partly, but also because I recognized something in you that first day. A refusal to be broken despite everything falling apart. It reminded me of her, yes, but it was also just you. The words warmed Clara more than the afternoon sun. She wanted to reach for his hand but maintained the careful distance they'd established since their charged moment after the hearing. When they reached the ranch, they found an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Watson, his horse tied to the porch rail. Afternoon, Jack. Miss Whitmore? The sheriff tipped his hat. I'm here on official business, I'm afraid. Clara's stomach dropped. Had Davies found some new legal avenue to pursue? What kind of business? Jack asked, his tone neutral, but his posture tense. There's been a complaint filed. Thomas Hartley claims some of his merchandise has gone missing, and he's suggesting you might know something about it. Miss Whitmore. What? Clara gasped. That's absurd. I haven't been near his store since the confrontation a few weeks back. I know, the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. I don't put much stock in Hartley's claim, but I have to investigate. He says you had access to his inventory records when you were engaged and that some items matching that inventory have shown up here at the ranch. Jack stepped forward, anger radiating from him. Are you seriously suggesting Clara is a thief? I'm not suggesting anything, Watson said carefully. But Hartley insists he's seen certain items, fabric mainly, and some household goods that he claims match his missing inventory. He wants to search the property. Over my dead body, Jack growled. He doesn't have the right to search, Clara said, her legal knowledge kicking in. Not without a warrant, which requires evidence presented to a judge. What evidence does he have beyond his word? Watson looked relieved that she understood the law. None that I can see. But he's making noise about getting that warrant. Says he has witnesses who've seen his goods here. Clara's mind raced. Then she realized the fabric I used to protect the garden from frost. Some of the household items I've been using. Jack purchased those from Murphy's store, not Hartley's. Can you prove that? Watson asked. Murphy keeps receipts, Jack said. I can show you exactly what we bought and when. Watson nodded. That would help. Look, between us, I think Hartley's trying to cause trouble because of the council hearing. But if you can show those purchases were legitimate, it'll end this before it starts. They spent the next hour gathering receipts and documentation. Clara was grateful for her own meticulous record-keeping, a habit from her law firm days. Every purchase was accounted for, every item's provenance clear. Watson reviewed everything carefully. This should do it. I'll tell Hartley his complaint is unfounded. But watch yourselves. He's angry about something, and angry men do stupid things. After the sheriff left, Clara sank into a chair, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. First his mother, now this. Will Thomas never leave me in peace? He's getting desperate, Jack said. His mother's arrival might have rattled him, especially if she's questioning his choices. And the whole town saw you best him at the council hearing. His pride's wounded. Male pride, Clara said bitterly. Such a fragile thing, yet it causes so much damage when bruised. Jack sat across from her. Not all male pride. Some of us can admit when we're wrong, when we need help, when a woman is our equal or better. You're not like most men, Jack Mercer. And you're not like most women, Clara Whitmore. They sat looking at each other across the table, the air between them thick with unspoken feelings. Clara wanted to reach out to bridge the gap, but the day's events reminded her how precarious her position remained. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jack answered it to find young Billy Turner from Town Cap in hand. Mr. Mercer. Miss Clara. My ma sent me. She says to tell you there's been an accident. Miss Collins, the lady who's supposed to marry Mr. Hartley. She fell down the stairs at his store. Doc's with her now, but Ma thought you should know Miss Clara. Clara was on her feet immediately. Is she badly hurt? Doc says maybe a broken arm, lots of bruises. She's asking for Mrs. Hartley Sr., but also... Billy shifted uncomfortably. She asked for you, Miss Clara. Said she needs to talk to you. Clara looked at Jack. I have to go. We have to go, Jack corrected. Billy, tell your ma we're coming. The ride to town was tense, both of them wondering what could have happened. Had Thomas's temper finally shown itself physically? Had Sarah tried to resist his control? They found chaos at the doctor's office. Thomas was pacing outside, his face flushed with anger. Mrs. Hartley Sr. sat in the waiting room, her expression stony. Several townspeople had gathered, drawn by the drama. You have no right to be here, Thomas snarled when he saw Clara. She asked for me, Clara replied calmly. That gives me every right. Before Thomas could respond, Doc Williamson emerged. Miss Collins is asking for Miss Whitmore and Mrs. Hartley Sr., no one else. Thomas started to protest, but the doctor held up his hand. She's my patient, and she's made her wishes clear. Ladies, if you'll follow me. Sarah Collins lay on the examination table, her left arm splinted, bruises already forming on her face and neck. She looked even younger and more fragile than before, and Clara's heart ached for her. Sarah, Eleanor said gently, taking the girl's good hand. What happened? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I told him I wanted to postpone the wedding, to accept your offer of employment. He was so angry. He grabbed my arm, shook me. I tried to pull away and fell backward down the stairs. He pushed you, Clara asked. Not exactly, but he wouldn't let go, and when I finally broke free, I was off balance. Sarah looked at Clara with desperate eyes. You were right about him. What you said at the council hearing, he doesn't see women as people, just things he can own. Eleanor's face was grim. We're getting you out of there, tonight. I have nowhere to go, no money, nothing. You'll stay with me at the hotel, Eleanor said firmly, as my companion starting immediately. Sarah looked at Clara. How did you do it? How did you find the courage to start over? Clara sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle Sarah's injuries. I didn't have a choice at first, but then I realized that being forced to be brave taught me I could be brave. You're stronger than you think. Thomas will be furious. Let him be, Eleanor said with steel in her voice. I'll handle my son. Doc Williamson returned. She needs rest, but she can be moved to the hotel if she's careful. I'll give you something for the pain, Miss Collins. As they helped Sarah sit up, she grasped Clara's hand. Thank you for standing up to him publicly. It made me realize I wasn't imagining things, that his behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. They emerged to find the waiting room even more crowded. Thomas immediately approached, but Jack stepped between him and the women. Sarah needs to explain, Thomas began. Sarah needs to rest and recover, Eleanor said coldly. She'll be staying with me at the hotel. She's my fiancée. Not anymore, Sarah said quietly but firmly. I'm breaking our engagement, Mr. Hartley. I'll be returning your ring as soon as I can retrieve my belongings. The room went silent. This was unprecedented, a mail-order bride rejecting her intended, especially after the previous bride had been rejected. Thomas's face went purple. You can't do this. You have a contract, which became void the moment you caused me physical harm, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. Any court would side with me. I never touched you. Multiple witnesses saw you grab her at the store, Sheriff Watson said from the doorway. He'd apparently been summoned by someone. And her injuries are consistent with her account. If she wants to press charges... No, Sarah said quickly. I just want to leave, peacefully. Thomas looked around the room, seeing condemnation in many faces. His mother's expression was perhaps the coldest of all. This is your doing, he spat at Clara. You poisoned her against me. No, Thomas, Eleanor said quietly. You did that all by yourself, just as your father poisoned me against him with his cruelty. The difference is, Sarah is lucky enough to escape before wasting decades of her life. The public nature of the rebuke from his own mother seemed to break something in Thomas. Without another word, he stormed out the door, slamming behind him. Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. I'll make sure he doesn't cause any more trouble tonight. Miss Collins, if you change your mind about pressing charges. Thank you, Sheriff. I just want this to be over. They helped Sarah to the hotel where Eleanor had already arranged for an adjoining room. As they settled her in, Clara felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a circle had closed. She'd been abandoned at that depot, left to fend for herself, but from that abandonment had come the strength to help another woman escape a worse fate. I should go, Clara said once Sarah was comfortable. Jack's waiting. Eleanor walked her to the door. Thank you, my dear, for everything. Take care of her. She'll need time to find her strength. And you? Eleanor asked. Have you found yours? Clara thought of the ranch, the garden finally thriving, the man waiting patiently outside. Yes, I think I have. She found Jack talking quietly with Sheriff Watson. Both men looked up as she approached. How is she? Watson asked. Shaken but determined. She'll be all right with Mrs. Hartley's help. Watson nodded. Good. I'll keep an eye on Thomas, make sure he doesn't try anything foolish. You two should head home before dark. As they drove out of town, Clara felt exhaustion settling into her bones. The day had been an emotional gauntlet, from Eleanor's unexpected alliance to Thomas's false accusations to Sarah's escape. You did a good thing, Jack said quietly, helping both of them. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. They were passing the spot where the road curved toward the ranch when Jack suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. What's wrong? Claire asked. Look. Ahead, silhouetted against the sunset, a rider waited in the middle of the road. As they drew closer, Clara recognized Thomas Hartley, his face twisted with rage. "You've ruined everything," he called out. "My marriage, my reputation, my mother's respect, you've destroyed it all." Jack's hand moved to his gun. "Right on, Hartley. You've caused enough trouble." "Not nearly enough." Thomas pulled out a pistol, pointing it at Clara. "You should have taken the ticket home. Should have disappeared like you were supposed to." Everything happened very quickly then. Jack moved to shield Clara while simultaneously drawing his own weapon. The crack of gunfire split the air, but it wasn't from Thomas or Jack. Sheriff Watson emerged from the rocks beside the road, his rifle trained on Thomas, who had dropped his pistol and was clutching his shoulder where Watson's bullet had grazed him. "I figured you might try something stupid," Watson said calmly. "You're under arrest, Hartley. Attempted murder ought to keep you locked up for a good while." Thomas collapsed to his knees, whether from pain or defeat, Clara couldn't tell. Watson secured him efficiently, then looked at Clara and Jack. "You folks all right?" "Yes," Clara managed, though her voice shook. "How did you know?" "Saw him riding out after you looking like murder. Figured I'd follow just in case." Watson hauled Thomas to his feet. "Come on, Hartley. Time to see how you like being powerless for a change." As Watson led Thomas away, Clara found herself shaking. Jack pulled her against him, his arms strong and safe around her. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "He can't hurt you anymore." Clara clung to him, the careful distance they'd maintained finally broken by crisis. "You would have taken a bullet for me." Without hesitation, she pulled back to look at him. "Jack? I know we said we'd take time, be careful, but Clara, I almost lost you tonight. I can't pretend anymore that you're just my housekeeper. You're everything. The ranch, my life, none of it means anything without you." Clara's response was to pull his head down and kiss him there in the middle of the road, with the sunset painting the desert gold around them. It was a kiss born of relief and recognition of weeks of careful restraint, finally abandoned. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "The town will talk," Clara said. "Let them. I'm done living my life according to their narrow rules. It could hurt the ranch's business. Then we'll find new buyers." Clara. "I've been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to share things with. Good things, bad things, ordinary things. You've brought my home back to life. You've brought me back to life." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "You saved me, Jack. Not just that first day, but every day since. You gave me purpose when I had none, respect when the world showed me none, and now you're giving me love. If I'm brave enough to take it." Jack cupped her face gently. "You're the bravest person I know, Clara Whitmore." "Then yes. Yes to all of it. To you, to the ranch, to whatever comes next." They kissed again, sealing the promise. When they finally continued home, Clara tucked against Jack's side on the wagon bench, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch looked different somehow as they approached not just a place of employment or even a home, but a future. Their future built from the ashes of separate disappointments into something neither had dared dream of. The weeks that followed the council hearing brought an unexpected peace to the Double M Ranch. The town's gossip gradually shifted to other scandals, and Clara found herself accepted, if not embraced, by most of the community. She could shop at Murphy's without whispers following her every move, and several women had even begun greeting her warmly at the general store. But the peace between Clara and Jack was more fragile, a careful dance of unspoken feelings and maintained boundaries. They worked together seamlessly during the day, but their evenings had become exercises in careful distance, each afraid that acknowledging what grew between them might shatter the delicate equilibrium they'd achieved. It was the announcement of Copper Creek's annual Founders' Day celebration that changed everything. Jack brought home the flyer from town, placing it on the kitchen table with studied casualness. "It's in 2 weeks. The whole valley comes. There's a dance in the evening." Clara studied the announcement, noting the various competitions and festivities planned. "Will you be entering the roping competition?" "Always do. Won it 3 years running before." He trailed off, and Clara knew he meant before his mother's death, before the ranch began struggling. "You should enter again," she encouraged. "Show them the Double M is still strong." Jack looked at her thoughtfully. "Would you come to watch? I mean, and maybe—" He paused. color rising slightly in his weathered cheeks. Maybe save me a dance. The invitation hung between them, weighted with more meaning than a simple request. To dance together publicly would be a declaration of sorts, a statement that their relationship had shifted beyond employer and employee. "I'd like that," Clara said softly. Jack's smile transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "Good. That's good." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Clara threw herself into making a new dress from fabric she'd bought with her saved wages, a deep green that brought out the color in her eyes. She worked on it in the evenings while Jack pretended to read, though she often caught him watching her fingers work the needle with fascinating intensity. "My mother used to sew in the evenings," he said one night. "Same chair, same lamp. It's nice having that again." "Tell me more about her." Clara invited her hands, never pausing in their work. Jack leaned back, his expression softening with memory. "She was small but fierce. Came from a good family back east, scandalized them all by marrying my father and heading west. She could shoot better than most men, ride anything with 4 legs, and still serve tea like she was in a Boston parlor." "She sounds remarkable." "She was. She would have liked you. You have that same combination of steel and grace." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest at the comparison. "I wish I could have met her." "She'd have probably tried to matchmake us within 5 minutes of meeting you," Jack said with a rueful laugh, then stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd said. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Clara finally said, "She'd have been right to try." Jack's head came up sharply, his eyes searching hers. "Clara." A loud crash from the barn interrupted them. The young colt had kicked through his stall door again, a habit he'd developed recently. Jack sighed and stood. "I'd better handle that before he hurts himself." Clara watched him go, frustrated by yet another interruption. It seemed the universe conspired to prevent them from finishing any conversation that might lead somewhere significant. The morning of Founders' Day dawned clear and hot, the desert already shimmering with heat waves by the time they loaded the wagon. Clara had packed a picnic basket with their entries for various competitions, her preserved peaches, a quilt she'd repaired and embellished, and bread that had won Jack's enthusiastic praise. "You're nervous," Jack observed as they drove toward town. "I've never been to anything like this," Clara admitted. "In St. Louis, social events were formal affairs with strict rules. This seems chaotic," Jack supplied with a grin. "Wait until you see the pie-eating contest. Last year, Tom Morrison, the judge's son, ate so much he was sick for 3 days." The town was transformed for the celebration. Bunting hung from every building, tables groaned under the weight of food, and games and competitions were set up in the field behind the church. The entire population of the valley seemed to have gathered, families spreading blankets, under whatever shade they could find, children racing between the adults, with sticky faces and grass-stained clothes. "Miss Clara." Sarah Collins appeared at her elbow, looking prettier and more confident than when Clara had last seen her. "I was hoping you'd be here." Clara was surprised by the warmth in the greeting. "Miss Collins, how are you finding Copper Creek?" Sarah glanced around, then leaned closer. "I wanted to thank you. What you said at the church social and then at that horrible hearing, it opened my eyes to certain things." "Oh." Clara kept her tone neutral, aware that Thomas might be nearby. "I've postponed the wedding," Sarah said quietly. "Indefinitely. I'm working at the hotel now, saving money. Mrs. Davies helped me get the position." Clara felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with concern. "Is Thomas giving you trouble?" "He tries, but I've learned to stand my ground. Watching you that day, seeing how you refused to be cowed, it taught me something important." Sarah squeezed Clara's hand. "So thank you." Before Clara could respond, Sarah melted back into the crowd, leaving Clara with a warm feeling of unexpected connection. She'd helped someone without even trying, simply by refusing to be diminished. "What was that about?" Jack asked, returning from registering for the roping competition. "Just proof that courage can be contagious," Clara replied, linking her arm through his without thinking. They spent the morning enjoying the festivities. Clara entered her preserves in the competition, blushing when they won second place. Her bread took first, which led to several women asking for her recipe. Jack competed in the horseshoe tournament, making it to the finals before losing to a rancher from the next valley. "You're popular today?" Jack observed as yet another woman stopped Clara to compliment her bread or ask about her garden. "It's strange," Clara mused. "A month ago I was a pariah. Now I'm almost respectable." "You were always respectable. It just took them a while to see it." The afternoon brought the roping competition. Clara found a spot near the fence where she could watch her heart racing as Jack entered the arena on bell. He looked confident and capable, handling his rope with the easy grace of long practice. The first round eliminated half the competitors. Jack qualified easily, his time among the best. The second round was harder, the calves more reluctant and the time limit shorter. But Jack managed it, his concentration absolute. It came down to Jack and two other ranchers for the final round. The first man missed his throw entirely, the calf dodging at the last second. The second managed to rope the calf but took too long securing it. Then it was Jack's turn. Clara held her breath as he positioned Belle, watching the calf with intense focus. The rope flew, landing perfectly around the calf's neck. Jack was off Belle, in an instant securing the calf's legs with practiced efficiency. "Time," the judge called. 8 seconds flat. "We have a winner!" The crowd erupted in cheers. Clara found herself clapping enthusiastically, pride swelling in her chest. Jack's eyes found hers across the arena, and his smile was just for her, warm and private, despite the public setting. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the dance floor that had been constructed in the main square. Musicians began tuning their instruments, and couples started gathering at the edges, waiting for the music to begin. Clara felt suddenly nervous. It was one thing to promise a dance in the privacy of their kitchen, another to actually step onto that floor under the eyes of the entire town. "Second thoughts?" Jack asked, appearing at her elbow. He'd cleaned up from the roping competition, his hair still damp from washing and his best shirt freshly pressed. "No," Clara said firmly. "No second thoughts." The music began, a lively reel that had couples spinning and laughing. Jack extended his hand formally. "Miss Whitmore, may I have this dance?" "Mr. Mercer, I'd be delighted." The moment they stepped onto the floor together, Clara knew everything had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained evaporated as Jack's hand settled on her waist, her hand in his, their bodies finding the rhythm of the music as naturally as breathing. They danced the reel, then a waltz, then another reel. Other couples joined and left the floor, but Clara was aware only of Jack, the warmth of his hand, the solid presence of his shoulder under her palm, the way he guided her through the steps with gentle confidence. "People are staring," she murmured during a slower dance. "Let them," Jack replied, spinning her gracefully. "I'm dancing with the most beautiful woman here. They should stare." Clara's breath caught at the open admiration in his voice. "Jack, I know we said we'd be careful." He continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know we have reasons to wait, but tonight, just tonight, can we pretend those reasons don't exist?" Clara looked up into his eyes, seeing her own longing reflected there. "Yes," she whispered. "Tonight, we're just Jack and Clara dancing at Founder's Day." They stayed on the floor through song after song, lost in their own world. Clara was dimly aware of comments from the crowd, some approving, others less so, but none of it mattered. In Jack's arms, she felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. It was during a break in the music, as they stood at the edge of the floor, catching their breath, that Thomas Hartley appeared. He was drunk, his face flushed, and his stance unsteady, and he had the look of a man bent on causing trouble. "Well, well," he slurred, "the fallen woman and her keeper making a spectacle of themselves." Jack tensed, but Clara placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Hartley, you're drunk. Go home." "Don't tell me what to do," Thomas snarled. "You've poisoned this whole town against me. Sarah won't marry me now, says I'm not the man she thought. That's your doing." "No," Clara said calmly. "That's your doing." Sarah simply had the wisdom to see it. Thomas lunged toward her, whether to strike or grab her, Clara couldn't tell. But Jack was already moving his fist, connecting with Thomas's jaw with a solid crack that sent the smaller man sprawling in the dirt. The music stopped. The crowd pressed closer, eager for drama. Thomas struggled to his feet, his nose bleeding, and Clara saw him reach for something in his coat. "Gun!" Someone shouted, and chaos erupted. But Jack was faster. His own gun was out and aimed before Thomas could clear his pocket. "Drop it, Hartley. This isn't worth dying over." Sheriff Watson pushed through the crowd. "What's going on here?" Hartley pulled a gun. Several voices confirmed. The sheriff looked at Thomas with disgust. "You're drunk and you pulled a weapon at a public gathering." "That's jail time, Thomas." "He attacked me," Thomas protested, pointing at Jack. "After you went after Miss Whitmore," someone in the crowd countered. Clara was surprised to see it was Ben Davies who spoke. "I saw the whole thing. Hartley was the aggressor." The sheriff hauled Thomas to his feet. "Come on, you can sleep it off in a cell." As Thomas was led away, still protesting, Jack holstered his gun and turned to Clara. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands were shaking slightly. "You didn't have to hit him." "Yes, I did," Jack said firmly. "No one threatens you, not while I'm breathing." The possessive protection in his voice should have bothered her independent nature, but instead it warmed her. This wasn't about thinking her weak. It was about claiming her as his to protect, just as she would protect him. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over. The musicians struck up another tune, trying to restore the festive atmosphere, but Clara could feel the shift in mood. "We should go," Jack said quietly. But before they could leave, Judge Morrison approached. "Mr. Mercer." "Miss Whitmore, after that display, I think you need to hear something." They followed him to a quieter corner away from the crowd. The judge looked between them with knowing eyes. "There's been talk," he began. "Not the usual gossip, but serious talk among some of the more influential citizens. About you two, about the propriety of your situation." Clara's heart sank, just when she thought they were past this. "However," the judge continued, "tonight's events have shifted things. Ben Davies speaking in your defense carries weight, and Thomas Hartley showing his true colors publicly helps your case considerably." "What are you saying?" Jack asked. "I'm saying that if you two were to make your arrangement more formal, shall we say, you'd find the town much more accepting. In fact, I'd venture to say most people are expecting it now after that display on the dance floor." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Judge Morrison, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," the judge said with a slight smile. "I'm simply observing that sometimes the most practical solution is also the one the heart wants. Good evening to you both." He walked away, leaving Clara and Jack standing in stunned silence. "Did he just tell us to get married?" Clara asked finally. "I think he did," Jack replied, looking as shocked as she felt. They stood there, the implications washing over them. Around them, the celebration continued, but they might have been alone in the desert for all the attention they paid to it. "We should go home," Jack said finally. "We need to talk." The ride back to the ranch was silent, both lost in thought. The moon was full, casting silver light across the desert, making everything look magical and unreal. Clara's mind raced through possibilities, fears, hopes, all tangled together like thread. When they reached the ranch, Jack helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist. They stood there in the moonlight, facing each other, the moment heavy with possibility. "Clara," Jack began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know how to do this right." "Do what?" she asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation. "Ask you to marry me without it seeming like I'm doing it for propriety's sake, or worse, that I'm trying to take advantage of your situation." Clara's breath caught. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Jack took her hands in his calloused palms warm against hers. "I'm trying to, badly, apparently." He took a deep breath. "Clara, when you arrived here, I thought I was saving you." "But the truth is, you saved me. You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. I don't want you as my housekeeper anymore." "Oh," Clara said, disappointment crashing through her. "No, wait, that came out wrong." Jack squeezed her hands. "I don't want you as my housekeeper because I want you as my wife, my partner, my equal in everything. Not because the town expects it, not because it's practical, but because I love you. I think I've loved you since you stood up to Thomas Hartley, that first time in town, refusing to be made small." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Jack, I know it's not the life you planned," he continued urgently. "It's hard here, isolated, and I can't offer you much beyond this ranch and my whole heart. But—" Clara silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. "Jack Mercer, stop talking. He froze, worry creasing his brow. The life I planned was a disaster, Clara said softly. It would have been a cage even if Thomas hadn't rejected me. This life, the one I never planned, has given me freedom, purpose, and now love. Because I love you too. I have for weeks, maybe longer. The joy that spread across Jack's face was like sunrise over the desert. Is that a yes? That's a yes. Jack whooped, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Clara laughed, clinging to his shoulders, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, they were both breathless, giddy with the moment. When? Jack asked. We could go to the judge tomorrow or wait for the circuit preacher. The preacher, Clara decided. I want to do this properly in the church with the whole town watching. Let them see that we're not ashamed, not hiding anything. That's my brave girl, Jack said softly, then paused. Can I kiss you now? I've been wanting to for so long. Clara answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper as weeks of restrained longing poured out. When they finally pulled apart, both were shaking slightly. I should go inside, Clara said, though she made no move to leave his arms. You should, Jack agreed, not releasing her either. They stood there holding each other in the moonlight, neither willing to break the spell. Finally, reluctantly, they separated. 2 weeks, Jack said. The preacher comes through in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Clara agreed, and then no more careful distance. No more careful anything. Jack promised, his eyes dark with promise. Clara went inside on unsteady legs, her lips still tingling from his kiss. Through her window, she watched Jack stand in the yard for a long moment, looking at the stars before heading to the barn to tend the horses. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prepare for a wedding, to make a dress, to ready herself for a life she'd never imagined but now couldn't imagine living without. The next morning brought a stream of visitors. News of the engagement had somehow spread overnight. Clara suspected the judge had something to do with that, and women arrived with congratulations and offers of help. Mrs. Davies was among the first, bringing fabric for Clara's wedding dress. It was my daughter's, she said, tears in her eyes. She died of fever before she could wear it. I'd be honored if you'd use it. Clara was overwhelmed by the generosity. Mrs. Davies, I couldn't. Yes, you can. You stood up to my husband and half the town for your right to be here. That took courage. I wish my daughter had lived to show. Please. Even Sarah Collins came by, offering to help with the dress. I'm quite good with a needle, she said shyly, and I owe you so much. The house filled with women, all talking and laughing and planning. Jack escaped to the range, claiming the cattle needed checking, but Clara caught his smile as he left. This was what had been missing from the ranch community connection, the sound of life beyond mere survival. As the women worked on the dress, they shared stories of their own courtships and weddings. Clara learned that many of them had faced their own struggles for acceptance, their own moments of standing against convention. The frontier changes people, Mrs. Murphy observed. It strips away pretense, shows who you really are. Some folks can't handle that truth, but those who can, like you and Jack, they build something real. The days flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Jack worked on the ranch with renewed energy, making repairs he'd put off, painting the porch, even attempting to tame the wild roses that grew by the well. He'd whistle while he worked, a happiness in his movements that made Clara's heart swell. In the evenings, they maintained a careful propriety, aware that the town was watching more closely than ever. But the awareness between them was electric, every accidental touch sending sparks through Clara's entire body. 3 days before the wedding, another crisis struck. Clara woke to the sound of cattle in distress. Racing outside, she found Jack already heading for the pasture where a portion of the herd had broken through a fence and scattered. Storm spooked them last night, Jack explained tersely. They've scattered across the valley. I need to round them up before they wander too far. I'll help, Clara said immediately. You don't know how to? Then teach me. You need help, and I'm here. Jack looked at her standing there in her wrapper and boots, ready to tackle whatever needed doing, and his expression softened. All right. Can you ride? I can learn. He saddled the gentle mare for her, giving quick instructions. Clara had ridden a few times in St. Louis, but nothing had prepared her for working cattle. Still, she managed to stay mounted and even helped drive a few strays back toward the main herd. They worked all day under the scorching sun, Clara learning to anticipate the cattle's movements to work with Jack in wordless coordination. By evening, they'd recovered most of the herd, though both were exhausted, sunburned, and covered in dust. "You did well," Jack said as they rode back. "Really well. You're a natural ranch woman." "I had a good teacher," Clara replied, then winced as she shifted in the saddle. "Though I may not walk properly for a week." Jack laughed. "You'll toughen up. My mother always said the desert either breaks you or makes you stronger. You're definitely the latter." That night, as Clara soaked her aching muscles in a hot bath, she thought about transformation. She'd come west as one person, a city woman seeking a conventional marriage, and had become someone entirely different, someone stronger, more capable, more herself than she'd ever been. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Clara stood in her room looking at herself in the small mirror. The dress the women had helped her create was simple but beautiful, the cream fabric setting off her sun-kissed skin. Her hair was pinned up with small wildflowers from her garden woven through it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara!" "The wagon's ready." She opened the door to find Jack standing there in his best suit, looking handsome and slightly nervous. He stopped mid-word, his eyes widening as he took her in. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony, Clara protested, though she was pleased by his reaction. "I don't much care for that tradition," Jack said, stepping closer. "I want to remember every moment of this day, starting with this one." They rode to town together, hands clasped on the wagon seat, neither caring who saw. The church was packed. It seemed the entire valley had come to witness the marriage of the mail-order bride who'd refused to disappear and the rancher who'd offered her sanctuary. Judge Morrison stood as a witness, Sarah Collins as Clara's attendant. The ceremony was simple, but moving, the preacher speaking about love found in unexpected places, about courage in the face of adversity, about two people choosing each other against all odds. When Jack said his vows, his voice was strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the church. "Clara, you came into my life when I'd forgotten how to hope. You've made the Double M a home again, made me whole again. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever the desert throws at us." Clara's voice was equally clear as she spoke her own vows. "Jack, you offered me shelter when I had nowhere to turn, but you gave me so much more. You gave me respect, partnership, and love. I promise to stand with you, work beside you, and love you through all our days." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack kissed her there in front of everyone, the church erupted in applause. Even Ben Davies, sitting in the back with his wife, was seen to nod approvingly. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch tables set up in the yard, lanterns strung from the porch to the barn. The whole community came bringing food and music and goodwill. Clara watched in amazement as their home for it was truly theirs, now filled with neighbors who had become friends. "No regrets?" Jack asked, pulling her aside for a moment of quiet. "None," Clara assured him. "This is everything I never knew I wanted." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Clara stood with her husband on the porch of their ranch, watching their guests dance and laugh in the yard. The garden she'd coaxed from reluctant soil bloomed nearby. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and the house that had once stood empty of warmth now overflowed with life. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, his arm around her waist. "I'm thinking about that day at the depot," Clara said. "How desperate I was, how lost. If someone had told me then that being abandoned would lead to this to you, to this life, I wouldn't have believed them." "The desert has a way of giving you what you need, not what you think you want," Jack said. "My mother used to say that. She was a wise woman." "She would have loved you," Jack said softly. "She would have loved seeing the ranch like this, full of life again." As if in response to his words, the wind chimes Clara had hung that morning began to sing their gentle melody, mixing with the fiddle music and laughter. It felt like a blessing, a welcome from the ranch itself to its new mistress. The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed, leaving Clara and Jack alone under the vast canopy of stars. They stood together, husband and wife, looking out at the land that had brought them together. Thank you, Jack said suddenly. For what? For being brave enough to stay that first day, for fighting for us when the town tried to drive you away, for choosing this life when you had other options. Clara turned in his arms, looking up at him with all the love she felt shining in her eyes. Thank you for seeing me not as damaged goods, but as someone worth taking a chance on. You were never damaged goods, Jack said firmly. You were a gift the universe sent me wrapped in unexpected packaging. They went inside together to begin their married life in the house that had sheltered their growing love. As Clara looked back one last time at the desert, now silver under the moon, she thought about unexpected journeys and unplanned destinations. She'd been returned at the depot like an unwanted package, but that rejection had led her to something far better than what she'd originally sought. She'd found not just a husband, but a partner. Not just a house, but a home. Not just survival, but a life rich with purpose and love. The desert had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately transformed her. And in Jack's arms, with the ranch spreading out around them and their future stretching ahead like an open road, Clara knew she was exactly where she belonged. The Double M Ranch would prosper in the years to come. The garden would expand, the cattle herd would grow, and eventually the sound of children's laughter would echo across the desert. But that was all in the future. Tonight there was just Jack and Clara, two souls who'd found each other against all odds, proving that sometimes the best love stories are the ones we never see coming. As they closed the door behind them, shutting out the world, Clara thought she heard the desert wind whisper its approval. Or perhaps it was just her imagination, colored by happiness so complete it made everything seem touched with magic. Either way, she was home,